The Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative at Duke Divinity School, in partnership with the Christian Medical and Dental Associations, welcomes you to our lecture series entitled Jesus and Medicine. What does Christianity have to offer healthcare?
Consider this case. L.C. is a 50-year-old carpenter. One day, L.C.'s wife notices his eyes look yellow. L.C. goes to see his doctor, and a workup confirms everyone's fears: metastatic pancreatic cancer. What does it mean to care well for L.C.? Further, how does what has come to be called palliative medicine or palliative care fit into good medicine for L.C.? Since the advent of the positive pressure mechanical ventilator in the late 1960s, the ethical concern most often voiced regarding end-of-life care, by patients and physicians, by Christians and non-Christians alike, has been how to free dying patients from the unnecessary suffering and degradation caused by the overuse of life-sustaining technologies. Have you seen this? The conventional strategy to address this problem has been to expand and to enhance hospice and palliative medicine. And they have been expanded. So much so that today it would be customary for L.C.'s physician to offer him a strategy that focuses on symptom control and function, setting aside chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery. Palliative medicine offers much to help patients who are dying. First, it provides a viable alternative to the default pathway of technological medicine. That default pathway makes it hard for patients like L.C. to die well because it absorbs so much time and attention and resources that could be devoted to other more worthwhile tasks. St. Basil wrote, "Whatever requires contrivance and fuss and involves much commotion and, as it were, turns our whole life into one long provision for the flesh, should be avoided by Christians. To put all hope of health in the hands of doctors is worthy of cattle," which we see happening in the case of some wretches who do not shrink from calling them saviors. The fact is that driving back and forth to the hospital leaves less time for reconciling with one's spouse or neighbors. And it is difficult to pray or write letters to one's children while retching from chemotherapy. Moreover, the default pathway of technological medicine isolates patients like L.C. from the communities, and church communities in particular, that can guide and support the patient in using the art of medicine, as St. Basil teaches, in such a way that we do not invest in it the whole cause of our health or sickness. So if nothing else, the growth of hospice and palliative medicine has removed the taken-for-grantedness of this default way of dying. But hospice and palliative medicine does more. It creates a recognizable social space in which a patient can be described as dying, not merely sick, and can therefore take on the dying role. One of the refreshing aspects of my work in hospice is that in my encounters with patients, the pretense of fixing the problem is gone. Everyone agrees that the patient is dying. This agreement has a way of focusing attention on how to support the patient as he or she dies. For medical practitioners, what can be done now to be helpful in the face of imminent death? For the patient, like L.C., how do I go on in preparation for the death that I cannot avoid? For L.C.'s wife and other members of his community, what does it mean to keep faith with and company with L.C. on this final part of his earthly journey? Moreover, because hospice and palliative medicine typically moves the patient out into the community and invites the community into the spaces of healthcare, it helps to make patients' community feel empowered to contribute what L.C. needs to die well. Now suppose that 2 weeks after his diagnosis, L.C. returns to see his primary physician. He looks tired and sad. "I'm not ready to die," L.C. says. "Why would God do this to me?" This not uncommon presentation highlights another way that hospice and palliative medicine helps patients who are dying, and that is by attending to the spiritual dimensions of patients' experiences. The National Consensus Project for Quality Palliative Care identifies spiritual, religious, and existential aspects of care as the fifth of 8 core domains of palliative care, and it is not alone. Many healthcare organizations agree that quality end-of-life care must include attention to the patient as a spiritual being. In all these ways, then, hospice and palliative medicine helps patients who are dying, and that's prior to relieving any pain or other symptoms. Well, where then is the rub? Palliative care can also undermine the possibility of Elsie dying well. First, palliative care risks usurping the roles that patient, family, clergy, and church community play in what was once called the ars moriendi. The term ars moriendi, which means the art of dying, refers to a literature that emerged in the Middle Ages in response to the bubonic plague. So many people were dying that the church just could not keep up with the usual rituals and practices of accompanying with those who were dying. In response, the church helped to promulgate a set of booklets to guide lay people and those around them in preparing to die. These initial booklets expanded to a literature that was disseminated all over Europe and shaped the way people lived and died for centuries. The point here is that dying well is a task primarily for the Christian in the context of his primary home, the church. And palliative care goes too far when it presumes to deliver, professionally packaged, a form of spiritual care that substitutes for the church's role in helping a member prepare to die. Hospice and palliative care also undermines the possibility of Elsie dying well when it diminishes his consciousness. Now, this often happens unintentionally. Narcotics, anxiolytics, and antipsychotics can be useful for relieving pain and anxiety, but they also can reduce patients' capacity to communicate, to pray, even to be relationally present to others. In the ars moriendi, clergy, family members, friends, even physicians can be present to the patient in the patient's suffering. This practice of presence goes to the heart of medicine, expressed in the term attending physician. Yet insofar as patient's consciousness is diminished, patient's experience of that presence is also diminished. So how do we navigate this tension between relieving suffering and sustaining the conditions needed for patients to die well? We first need to recognize that relieving suffering is not the only good, that when the side effects of a medication render the patient incapable of further conscious activity, that patient has lost something valuable. Physicians often fail to recognize sedation as an adverse side effect. Indeed, sometimes the goal of comfort seems to displace all other goals, and the patient's further participation in the ars moriendi seems like a triviality. I propose to you that to serve the ars moriendi, palliation, the relief of suffering, should be understood as a set of practices internal to medicine rather than as the basis for a rival form of professionalized care. Now, at the outset, I asked, how does the work of palliative care practitioners fit into good medicine for LC? Here we begin to see why and how the answers that are characteristically given to this question go wrong. They go wrong first because contemporary medicine and medical ethics have come to deny the idea that medicine has a rational end, a purpose that we do not merely make up, but instead recognize and respect, and which gives physicians a standard to guide their practices. There have been times and places in which it was axiomatic that the purpose of medicine was health. Aristotle wrote, "Now since there are many actions, arts, and sciences, their ends also are many. The end of the medical art is health, that of shipbuilding, a vessel, that of strategy, victory, that of economics, wealth." Aristotle took these claims as starting points for practical reason, as what philosophers call basic, as things known immediately by both the many and the wise. The Church, throughout her history, has likewise taken for granted that the purpose of secular medicine, the Church's term for medicine based on the science of the day, is healing. St. Basil says that God gave us the art of medicine as he gave us the art of agriculture. Both are remedies for deficiencies in our nature after the fall. We are susceptible to the lack of food, and God has given us agriculture so that we might eat. We suffer injuries and illness, and God has given us medicine so that our health might be preserved and restored. It may seem counterintuitive, however, to think of palliation as aiming at health. Palliation, it seems, is what doctors do when they can no longer restore a patient's health. Yet even in the presence of disease, even a disease like pancreatic cancer, a measure of health remains. As Leon Cass memorably put it, health is the well-working of the organism as a whole, or put another way, an activity of the body in accord with its specific excellences. The health of a squirrel, Cass noted, is displayed in the characteristic activities of squirrels, such as burying nuts, chattering, and climbing trees. Because the characteristic activities of humans are more varied, so are their expressions of health. But such expressions surely include the capacity to move one's bowels, to eat and digest food without vomiting, to sit or lie or walk without racking pain, to stay awake and to fall asleep at the proper times. Physicians cannot return LC to the state of health he had before his diagnosis, but if they help him along the way to preserve and restore these capacities, then they will have contributed to his health. And it's just these sorts of contributions to health that make it possible for patients like LC to engage in the Ars Moriendi, which rarely involves climbing mountains or running marathons, but does require some attention, some thought, perhaps some communication through voice or writing, and being present relationally to others. Here an important distinction comes into view. It's one thing for health professionals to palliate disabling symptoms with an eye to preserving and restoring a measure of health. It's another thing for healthcare professionals to palliate symptoms without respect to whether doing so restores health. Physicians are tempted to ignore this distinction. Returning to our case, let's say that LC goes through chemotherapy, his disease progresses, he sees his physician and says, "Doc, if I come to the point in which I cannot tolerate living any longer, and if I ask you to do so, would you sedate me until I'm unconscious and keep me that way until I die?" At a later visit, he adds, "It's very important for me, Doc, to have some autonomy and control at the end of life. I don't expect I'll need to use it, but would you provide me a prescription for medicines that I can take to end my life if I cannot go on?" How is it that LC, along with the good people of California, Oregon, Washington, the District of Columbia, Colorado, Vermont, Hawaii, Montana, and New Jersey, the list grows by the year, have come to see sedation unto death or physician-assisted suicide as perhaps the most reasonable courses of action when they face the prospect of losing their capacities? There's more to be said than I can cover here, but it is evident that the cultures of modern industrialized societies like our own do not form in their citizens imaginations capable of receiving unwanted suffering, death, and loss of control as anything other than meaningless burdens. If LC or his physician is not capable of seeing his suffering and loss of control as occasions in which redemptive purposes may still be at work, as experiences that invite LC, the sufferer, to new and worthwhile practices, then the purpose of medicine, to preserve and restore LC's health, seems beside the point. Under this cultural pressure, then, the medical profession has been steadily setting aside the constraints imposed by aiming only at health, and it has been taking on more expansive aims. For example, the World Health Organization defines palliative care as an approach that improves the quality of life of patients and their families facing the problems associated with life-threatening illness through the prevention and relief of suffering by means of early identification and impeccable assessment and treatment of pain and other problems, physical, psychosocial, and spiritual. Whew. That may sound wonderfully holistic, but note how this definition gives palliative care a boundless scope of responsibility. What problems, after all, are excluded from the categories of physical, psychosocial, and spiritual? If LC's physician sets out to minimize LC's suffering and to maximize his quality of life, then it seems that the physician has good reason to aim at LC's death itself as one of her goals. A growing proportion of the public and of the medical profession has come to think in just this way. To give just one prominent example, the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization describes hospice as follows: "Hospice affirms the concept of palliative care as an intensive program that enhances comfort and promotes the quality of life for individuals and their families When cure is no longer possible, hospice recognizes that a peaceful and comfortable death is an essential goal of health care. Note these shifts from aiming at health to maximizing quality of life, from proportionate relief of symptoms to minimizing suffering, and from helping patients who are dying to helping patients to die by giving them a good death, where a good death is one chosen by the patient and as free of suffering as possible. Why turn back? Why constrain palliative medicine for patients like Elsie to the traditional goals of medicine? To begin, boundaries help to resist against endemic temptations. Physicians who care for patients with advanced illness have long known that both they and their patients will at times be tempted to do away with the suffering by doing away with the sufferer. To resist this temptation, physicians have for 2+ millennia sworn in the Hippocratic Oath, "I will enter homes only for the good of the sick," and "I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody who asks for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect." This boundary not only gives patients a reason to trust physicians, but it also gives physicians the freedom they need to do their work. When I take care of patients and their families who are wary of what hospice will do to the one who is dying, it helps very much that I can tell them that as a physician, I'm committed never intentionally to hasten or cause a patient's death. Never. This boundary creates a space in which I can treat distressing symptoms decisively and can accept side effects, even the unintentional but foreseen side effect of hastening the patient's death, if I have proportionate reason to do so. Without this boundary, however, then patients and family members have good reason to worry that the morphine is dosed not in proportion to the pain or breathlessness that the patient experiences, but in an effort to hurry the dying process along. The question of trust is paramount. Already, the work of hospice and palliative medicine is inhibited by the fact that many Americans are suspicious that it has unmoored itself from the constraints traditionally respected by the profession of medicine. Moving from proportionate palliation, for example, to rationalized processes of making people dead. When physicians set themselves outside the traditional constraints and goals of medicine, and when we fail to recognize and respect the value of what was once called the ars moriendi, we erode the public trust we need to provide appropriate palliation to patients like Elsie. To the extent patients like Elsie distrust hospice and palliative medicine, they will go without all of the good it can do to contribute to the conditions necessary for dying well. To summarize, by setting palliation within and under the constraints of medicine, rather than as an alternative and more expansive form of professionalized care, physicians can sustain a proper humility and focus on a limited but very important role, a role recognized and honored by the Church throughout her history. Rather than usurping or undermining the ars moriendi, physicians would work to preserve and restore those measures of health that make it possible for patients to engage in the tasks of dying well.
For reflection questions and other resources, visit tmc.divinity.duke.edu/JesusandMedicine.